Thank you very much for coming. It's very nice of you all to come out on a Friday afternoon. I'm thrilled to see so many familiar faces here in the room with me. I'm Steve Pitti. I'm professor of history and American studies, and I direct ethnicity, race, and migration here at Yale. And I'm the master of Ezra Stiles College. And it's really an honor to play a small role in the inauguration of Peter Salovey, and in that capacity to get a chance to share some of my work with you. When César Chávez died in late April of 1993, more than 20 years ago at age 66, immediate words of praise and reverence were heard from many, though not quite all, sectors of the United States. Chávez passed away in his sleep, not far from his childhood home in southern Arizona, where he'd been born to landowning parents in 1927, and where he was then, in 1993, helping to defend the United Farm Workers Union, which he'd directed for more than 30 years, against a lawsuit by the Bruce Church Corporation. Cesar's son-in-law, Arturo Rodriguez, who has served as the United Farm Workers president since 1993, caught the news about Chávez's death while listening to Radio Campesina, the radio station which the union had founded during the 1970s. Cesar's son, Paul Chávez, reached longtime union vice president Dolores Huerta in Salinas on the phone, who rushed to the local UFW office to share the news. Distraught workers organized a mass at Sacred Heart Church that afternoon, guided by Huerta's injunction that they emphasize, quote, Cesar's life being a celebration and one of nonviolence and one of peace, to turn this into a positive thing. The press stories that broke later that day and over the following days included emotional tributes from dozens of labor and civil rights leaders who'd worked with Chávez over the decades. President Clinton called him, quote, an inspiring fighter and an authentic hero to millions of people throughout the world, and the following year, in 1994, bestowed upon him posthumously the Presidential Medal of Freedom. From California and Oregon and Washington State to Idaho and Missouri and Maryland and Washington, D.C., the last 20 years have seen many monuments to Cesar Chávez, many efforts to remember him. By my count, 14 parks, 25 streets, 7 libraries, 46 schools, 10 buildings on college campuses, and 1 unincorporated town on the US-Mexico border, all named after him. The renaming of these public signs has been, in many places, a hard-fought battle, but in general, it's proven far easier for Americans to deal with the dead Cesar than it was for them to deal with the living. Now, of course, discussions of the United Farm Workers' legacy since Chávez's death have coincided with a major demographic Latinization of the United States over the last 34 years. From something like 14.6 million Latinos in the US in 1980 to around 52 million as of 2011. Even most of the United Farm Workers' detractors in 1993 on the moment of Chávez's death made nice for at least a brief moment in the season of the funeral, with the spokesman for California's Grape Workers and Farmers Coalition telling the press that, quote, Cesar was a tough and tenacious individual who fought for what he believed in. We respected his perseverance. And the president of Bruce Church, with whom the farm workers were then fighting in the courts, registering, quote, appreciation for his spirit in what he did. Even conservative Republican California Governor Pete Wilson ordered that the state capitol fly its flags at half-mast in memory of Chávez. So dissonant voices stayed mostly quiet, with just a few exceptions. Quote, I think his legacy is very little, announced longtime union opponent John Jamara, a grower in the Central Valley. The UFW hasn't played much of a role for more than 20 years. Now, my own perspective is different than John Jamara's, not surprisingly, and in a sense may take off from the work of critics like Mexico's Carlos Monsiváis, who's long reminded readers to pay attention to those who, quote, ejercen la democracia desde abajo y sin pedir permiso, those who exert democracy from below without asking for permission, in the process expanding their rights by exercising them. What follows then today is my effort to think through some themes, just a few of them, that lie at the heart of some of my recent work in Mexican-American history, that attempt to reckon with our new appreciation for the varying roles that the United Farm Workers and Chavez have played in the political spheres of the 20th and 21st century US, and that focus in particular on religiosity, prompted in part here by the ecumenical coalitions that formed around Latino labor and civil rights demands since the 1990s, as churches really have led the way in recent years in calling for more humane approach, for example, to immigration reform. So it's my argument today that Chavez did exert democracy from below, in Monsiváis's phrase, and that he made expansive political demands by bringing religiosity into the farm labor struggle in new ways. Over the last 50 years, American politics has developed in part because of that emphasis of Chávez's during his lifetime. It was for this reason that upon Chávez's death, UFW supporters and others drew immediate comparisons between Caesar and other fallen leaders, a form of veneration that was more, in their eyes, forward-looking than it was backward-looking. Many were anxious in 1993 that the UFW had been built on Chávez's charismatic leadership, and what would they do now? He had been the union's sole president for the entirety of its 31-year history, and although he'd exerted great energy in the 1960s and the 1970s, turning down individual awards and emphasizing that no single leader defined the farm worker movement, the 15 years prior to his death had seen him concentrate more and more power and authority in his and in his family's hands. In making sense of the president's death, union and civil rights leaders and workers themselves were forced to reckon with questions of succession and about the nature of the farm worker movement itself. Moving forward, in April 1993, those who stepped in to lead the United Farm Workers built on established ways of harnessing death for political purposes among California's Mexican Americans in particular, an approach that Chavez had himself helped to define in previous decades. Martyrs and prophets had long played important ideological roles in civil rights. As a leading California activist during the 1950s, Chavez had literally wrapped the caskets of returning Korean War soldiers in the mantle of the Community Service Organization, the group that Chavez helped to lead and to found in California during the 1950s. As a leader of the United Farm Workers Union after 1962, he subsequently made fellow activists who died on picket lines into union heroes, establishing during the late 1970s, for example, that August 16th and January 24th would be set aside as annual holidays for the union, and declaring that a memorial mass would be held in the martyrs' memories at each union convention every year. It was within this movement culture that many in 1993 declared with hope that Chavez, now dead, would continue to play a fundamental role in social justice work in the future, and that his spirit would continue to unite working people. One farm worker at the funeral was heard to say, quote, "Muerto, no señor. Su cuerpo se murió, pero César Chávez está vivo. Aquí, mire, en toda esta gente, en todos los campesinos, nosotros somos César Chávez." Dead, no sir. His body died, but César Chávez is alive. Here, look, in all of these people and all of the farm workers, we are César Chávez. It was in this spirit that Chavez was likened to martyrs and to prophets worldwide. San Jose's Enrique Dominguez and many others immediately called him our Martin Luther King. He was our Gandhi, said Democratic State Senator Art Torres. When his body arrived at the union's headquarters in La Paz, California, not far from Bakersfield the following day, a crowd lined the gates of the UFW property to sing movement songs. 500 friends and family members attended a mass that night on that property, including notables like Martin Sheen, who flew in from Pennsylvania, where he'd been making the film Gettysburg. Prior to the beginning of the service, Union officer David Martinez pulled the priest from the local Tehachapi diocese aside and provided a suggestion for the homily that night. Quote, "It's real important that the people remember that Jesus didn't establish the church. Jesus recruited, organized, taught, and set them up and showed them the way, everything they needed to know. And when he died, they're the ones that went out and built that church. And that's their charge now. The union's foundation is laid, but they're going to have to go and build it." Prompted in this way, the priest indeed delivered the message about Caesar the prophet, allowing Huerta and others in the union leadership to emphasize in turn that the union would continue. Tens of thousands of people turned up to the funeral itself. Volunteers had flocked to the town of Delano in Central California to help the union organize the funeral service within hours of Caesar's death. Some brought lawnmowers and beat up hoes to make parking lots out of overgrown fields. Groups of women brought scissors and thread to make UFW flags. Farm workers abandoned California field and orchard jobs, and Ray Ramirez, a 50-year-old ex-United Automobile worker member from Milpitas, California, in the Bay Area, spoke for many urban residents when he told the press that, quote, "I come from the fields. I have to identify with these people." Bronx Congressman, not far from here, Jose Serrano, drew attention to Chavez's importance to, quote, "the Puerto Rican field laborers in the East and to industrial workers everywhere," while television personality Geraldo Rivera called the UFW president the most important Latino of the 20th century. The funeral itself became, I think, the largest such ritual ever held for a labor leader in U.S. history. 12,000 attended the rosary held for Chavez, and some 2,000 kept vigil overnight to watch the sunrise over his casket in advance of the burial. Chavez was then buried at the union's headquarters in La Paz, where his grave in the following weeks and months and years would draw thousands of visitors, and where memorials at his gravesite would serve as gathering places and gathering times in which activists from around the country and even around the world have met to call for new policies and new campaigns. While the image of Chavez has increasingly become a rallying point for Latinos generally, for civil rights campaigns, for diversity issues, Caesar had quite mixed feelings about putting himself forward as the face of the farm worker movement while he was alive, as I've already said. Trained as a community organizer in the Saul Alinsky tradition, he warned others about the dangers of charismatic leadership during his younger years. And he worked hard throughout the 1970s and the 1980s to train farm workers, modest people, as lawyers, as community activists, as public spokespersons, in ways that he hoped would decenter the public's focus on him. But since his death, there can be no doubt that the UFW leadership has promoted Chavez's memorialization vigorously through postage stamps and through the renaming of schools, linking the organization's reputation today and its success today to its long-dead president. A community of memory has also formed among one-time volunteers for the UFW, people who ran the boycotts of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, who found one another online and have put together a remarkable archive documenting their history. And certainly some of the talk of Chavez today has something to do with this very impressive archival project that you see down at the bottom. And Chavez's one-time lieutenants, those who worked with him and for him in the Union from the 1960s into the 1990s, have often operated in his name in the last 20 years. First among them is Dolores Huerta, the second most powerful figure in the Union from the 1960s into the early 1990s, and still a major activist around labor, immigration, feminist, and LGBT issues today. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in May 2012. At age 83, she's still traveling more than 150 days out of the year. But other activists and policymakers schooled by the United Farm Workers have also been key to Latino and U.S. politics since 1993. Eliseo Medina, until about 2 weeks ago, second in command of the Service Employees Industrial Union. Marshall Gans of Harvard University, who engineered Obama's Wisconsin strategy in 2008, here on the left. Miguel Contreras and Antonio Villaraigosa, head of the Los Angeles County Federation of Labor and the past mayor of Los Angeles. Former U.S. Secretary of Labor, Hilda Solis, and many more were schooled in the campaigns of the United Farm Workers in advance of Chavez's death. And then there are the everyday people around the country with posters and other images of Chavez on the walls of their homes or their workplaces, or people who have created altars in his name at holiday time or around his birthday or at political events. With these images in mind, let me get back now to Chavez's life work, leaving the gravesite, leaving the altars, and leaving the passions expressed around his body in 1993 behind, to reflect on the ways in which Chavez had helped to build a movement shaped by religiosity that would eventually treat him as a martyr or a prophet or a saint after his death. What I want to say today is not so much about theology. I'm no theologian. There are others in the room who are. Nor is it meant to validate any way of thinking about what's sacred, what's providential, or what's divine. I'm certainly not arguing that Chavez actually was a saint, although some do. Far from it. But if there's one thing I've learned in my recent research, it's that the UFW was and is, in many senses, a religious movement in the eyes of many of its core adherents, and that the Farm Workers Union, and particularly its now dead president, continue to be invoked with a sort of holy reverence and awe. His effect on the contemporary civil rights movement and on the immigrant rights movement today in 2013 has, for me, I think, religious overtones in the way he is discussed. The connections made to Gandhi, to King, to others are no doubt part of this. And those connections made between farm worker campaigns in California and elsewhere and global struggles for justice emerged thanks to Chavez and other activists over time. Even 20 years after his death, many major political debates today that surround Latinos and that surround farm workers continue to run through this person. What would Cesar do about immigration reform, about affirmative action or bilingual education, environmental cleanup campaigns, the establishment of ethnic studies, electoral redistricting, and on and on. If there is a modern Latino saint from the late 20th century, one who's invoked, if not prayed to, though some do, and one whose powerful legacies are still channeled today in secular campaigns that seek to add an otherworldly dimension to liberation struggles, that figure, I think, is Chavez. Now, there are good reasons for foregrounding the religious history of the United Farm Workers Union that Cesar ran. Recall that the union's roots lay in the 1950s and early 1960s, not within the declarations of secularism that defined the left around 1968. The UFW was earlier. The UFW emerged in the season of the Second Vatican Council, in an era in which Latin American social movements far to the south of California were redefining issues related to the church, to Jesus as liberator, and to the meaning of justice on earth. Churches influenced Mexicans and Mexican Americans far more than labor unions during these years, during the Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy years. Chávez himself was radicalized in part through the teachings of a progressive parish priest in Northern California whom he met in 1952, a priest who insisted that Chávez read the papal encyclicals on social justice, a priest who traveled throughout the state arguing for farm workers' rights to unionize already, and who wrote letters of introduction to other priests around California on César's behalf, explaining that this young organizer was a good Catholic and not a communist. And César was very religious as a young man, and he would remain so throughout his life. A devout Catholic, a person deeply engaged with the politics of the Catholic Church, but also of ecumenism and ecumenical thinking as it was developing in the 1960s and 1970s, a self-taught student of world religions who was interested in Jainism and Hinduism, very interested in Judaism, interested in most of the major world religions, who became fascinated with new religious practices emerging in California during these years, of movements like Est or Synanon, and who also considered himself in his later years to be something of a faith healer, who in his last decade or so of life believed that he was, like his own grandmother, a curandero, a curer, a healer, who was able to lay hands on people and to make them well. And there are many stories that people who think reverentially about César tell about César supposedly healing people who were sick in the Union. At the very moment in the early 1960s, in which the bishops began gathering in Rome to debate the reforms that would increase the role of the laity in local parishes, scale back the presumed authority of priests, de-emphasize the Latin Mass, and call for new ecumenical connections, Chávez moved to the Central Valley of California to begin organizing agricultural workers. That was 1962, as I've said. The same year in which Chávez and many other Mexican Americans who'd been involved in California politics began to take weekend spiritual retreats meant for Spanish-speaking men throughout the world. Retreats that were called the Cursillo and that began in Spain. Retreats in which Chávez and others devoted themselves to considering the connections between faith and social justice and their own community responsibilities as men. César did his 3-day spiritual retreat in the small California town of Reedley, where he reflected on the themes of piety, study, and action. His notes about his time at the retreat center include musings on, quote, the social order. It must be changed. Our faith must influence it. Unions, organizations, clubs, etc. He entered that retreat experience hoping to find a small group organizing model that he could then use to educate farm workers in union principles. And he spent a good deal of time at the retreat center on that long weekend writing the constitution for the labor organization that he would go on to found. He left that all-male gathering with new ideas, too, about self-sacrifice, ideas that would lead him by the late 1960s to argue against the masculinist politics that had come to define black and brown power. Quote, to be a man is to suffer for others. God help us to be men, he wrote. A few days after leaving the retreat house, he would organize a group of farm workers to take over a routine State Department of Industrial Welfare meeting in Fresno. This was his first victory as a farm labor unionist. Chávez also left that retreat house singing De Colores, one of the fundamental anthems of the farm labor movement and of the Chicano movement that followed it, and a fixture in preschool world music curricula today. I'm sure some of you know it. That Cursillo song, about the beauties of the rural world served its purposes well. Chávez had been looking to infuse the 1950s Mexican-American politics with new life and with passion. Groups like the Community Service Organization and LULAC of the past decade had little of the raucous spirit that had defined popular front groups during the 1930s and the 1940s, where the earlier left had danced, the 1950s crowd seemed insistent on Robert's Rules of Order. Chavez wanted to import into the farm labor movement something of the emotional abandon that he had seen and heard in Mexican Pentecostal churches and African American Baptist churches in small rural towns. The place of music in union meetings, of linking hands to sing Mexican corridos written about local growers or California politicians, or the singing of Nosotros venceremos, we shall overcome in Spanish, or Huelga en General, General Strike, a song brought back from Cuba to California in the early 1960s, turned Chavez's organization into more of a camp meeting than anything Mexican Americans had seen anywhere in the United States for decades. This fact made the United Farm Workers a demonstrably new social movement, one that took a new direction from the 1950s organization precisely because it attempted to mobilize people's spirits in new ways. Spirit was an important keyword for the movement. Chavez spoke openly about the spirit of the Mexican Revolution, of achieving the justice promised to activists' immigrant grandparents who had fought with Zapata or with Villa during the 1910s. And after 1962, Chavez organized through religion, speaking about rights and spirit conveyed by God, and emphasizing that rural unionization fulfilled the mission of many faith communities to work for justice on this earth. By framing political debates and demands, at least in part through religious language, Chavez hoped to stress to farm workers their own basic dignity and to emphasize an emphasis that contradicted the 20th century's ongoing cultural representations of rural, laboring agriculturalists as beasts of burden, as faceless even in the most muckraking photographs, as content with their lot or too frightened to do anything about their situations. Dignity and respect, dignidad y respeto, were keywords for the movement unmediated by distinctions of race or gender or citizenship. They called upon audiences of farm workers to struggle on behalf of the Bill of Rights and what they were owed by the government, but more importantly, to exceed those promises. Following the emphasis of the prophets, Chavez saw himself telling groups that while he might not see the signing of good labor contracts anytime soon, his followers would one day see that promised land. These, in Chavez's eyes, were references to biblical time. He told the Brazilian Catholic educator and urban activist Paulo Freire that, quote, the difference between the growers and the farm workers union is that the growers have money and the workers have time. We don't have exceptional skills or finances, but we have a lot of dedicated people and a lot of time. In the hands of Chavez and of the UFW, religion, combined with dedication, was meant to shape consciousness raising, to bring a new concientización to rural people, the poor, the excluded, the racialized, the immigrant, who had rarely expressed a public politics before. Chavez contended that farm workers who came to recognize their core dignity would no longer take for granted their maltreatment in American society. As their common sense about the world changed, Chavez told an anti-Vietnam rally, Mexican Americans and Filipinos in California would say no to, quote, a life of economic slavery, and they would turn, quote, their sacrifices and their suffering into a powerful campaign for dignity and for justice. This was social theory, a theory of political action framed by dignity and by suffering as commonly understood Catholic principles. Chavez did all this in ecumenical ways, building on the coalitions that he had helped to forge during the 1950s that connected Mexican-American civil rights to Quaker and Jewish activists statewide, and that had emerged at the local level in neighborhoods like Boyle Heights, California, where Jews and Mexican Americans interacted as neighbors from the 1930s into the 1950s. But while activists in the 1950s had taken money and support from non-Catholics, Chavez and others during the 60s and 70s actually brought other faith traditions into the movement itself. A Star of David hung in the union's headquarters. A family of Spanish-speaking farm workers who ran boycott operations in faraway Pittsburgh named their newly born daughter Shalom. And union meetings featured invocations from Protestant and Catholic officials. In pushing for ecumenical coalition building, by the way, these farm worker activists thought differently than some of their contemporaries in the emerging Chicano movement, those who were distancing themselves from black churches, or who followed the lead of some in the black or brown power movements in blaming urban minorities' impoverishment on Jews. The UFW would have none of that. So by contrast, the UFW under Chavez's leadership worked hard to link faith in its broadest forms and action. Chavez and others involved in the grape strike that began in September of 1965 worked hard to involve religious leaders, largely as a way to broaden the struggle beyond repressive small-town California. Invited to Delano from congregations throughout the country in the early months of the grape strike, ministers and priests and rabbis nearly always left ready to announce that a new social struggle, one that many believed carried forward the best traditions of the African American freedom struggles, had now appeared on the West Coast. These visitors affirmed the spiritual bases of the struggle and their own place within it. One ecumenical delegation declared in the mid-1960s that, quote, "We reject the heresy that churches and synagogues are to be concerned only with so-called spiritual matters. The suffering of farm workers and of their children cries to heaven and demands the attention of men of conscience." A New York Times reporter called these religious leaders Chavez's, quote, "secret weapon." And Chavez would later admit that churches had proven far more helpful than students or labor unionists in his organization's early struggles. When, 6 months after the start of the grape strike, the union marched more than 300 miles from Delano to the state capital of Sacramento to publicize their demands, it was no accident then that they marched during Lent and that they held the state's largest to date Latino political rally on the Capitol lawn here on Easter Sunday of 1966. Their 10,000 marchers ambling up Highway 99 did so behind the flag of the Virgin of Guadalupe, an icon that had, since the 1920s, since the era of the Cristero Revolt in Mexico, rarely if ever been used by progressive civil rights forces in the US until 1966. But they also communicated a deep commitment to ecumenism and to coalition building, which was equally new in the West, announcing that activists who'd begun to feel marginalized by the rise of black power in the South would be welcome in the California farm worker struggle. Members of Jewish community relations councils from the San Francisco Bay Area and other marchers took part on this march in religious services co-celebrated by priests and by rabbis. And it was a California rabbi who gave the benediction at the end of the Easter rally, lauding Chavez as a, quote, self-effacing but incredibly efficient, modern-day, nonviolent Emiliano Zapata. It was the language of nonviolence, combined with the union's insistence on penitence and on pilgrimage, that deeply touched many religious and non-religious supporters during the mid and late 1960s. Chavez's fast for nonviolence in 1968, the union's most important publicity moment by far during the 1960s, established Chavez's image as a saint in the global media through the circulation, above all, of the image of the emaciated Mexican-American alongside Bobby Kennedy at the Mass concluding this fast. The assassination of Martin Luther King, less than a month after Chavez's 25-day fast ended, brought the UFW new adherents, as many believed that this farm worker leader was now the one carrying forward the spirit of the SCLC's apostle of nonviolence. It was the language of fasting, movement activists always insisted, that was critical to the organization's success. That term, fasting, evoked penance, self-denial, efforts at bodily and moral regulation, and was not intended, they said, to make explicit demands on growers or others. This was not, in other words, a hunger strike that would only end with some union victory. For some, these fasts seemed like modest gestures, but Chávez clearly meant the fast in part as what he called, following Gandhi, moral jujitsu, an effort to aggravate the sense of growers' power by displaying your own relative weakness. And at every turn, the union took pains throughout these fasts to send a broadly inclusive message. The 1968 celebration here, in which Chávez ended the 25-day fast at Robert Kennedy's side, a gathering of 9,000 in Delano, opened with a Hebrew prayer, a Protestant sermon, and then the Catholic Mass. So this, I think, was part of the political brilliance of the United Farm Workers. The visible practice of penance and of self-denial proved more responsible than any other factor for the success of the Great Boycott nationally and internationally. Just as thousands marched with him in 1966 and in many later marches, hundreds arrived to visit Chávez's bedside to help care for him each day, they hoped, during his fasts in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and into the early 90s, as he was still fasting. Calling attention to this discursive form of politics shouldn't discount, of course, the hard battles of boycott organizers who spent years on picket lines and in supermarket parking lots trying to urge shoppers to forego certain purchases in the interest of helping poor farm workers. But it does suggest that they and others out there in the parking lots and on the picket lines depended very heavily on a discourse about sacrifice and about humility that was meant both to emphasize, on the one hand, the humanity of rural workers, and on the other, to define the roles of urban consumers in achieving social justice. Part of the message sent by Chávez and other UFW organizers during this period was that, however corrupt the national policies of the United States might be, Americans and others could follow the higher laws that ought to govern humanity, religious laws, through particular acts of conscience that would have real effects for those living in rural areas. The religious subtexts of the grape and lettuce boycotts were fundamentally useful because they helped the UFW claim a moral terrain that rose above the complicated political economies of Western agriculture, that commanded moral attention. The political economies of agriculture were becoming far more complicated by the 1970s than they had been in the 1960s. And growers and others who opposed the United Farm Workers did their best to accentuate that sense of complexity. Rival Teamster unionists, many of them Mexican Americans, some of them actually farm workers, won many contracts of their own at the UFW's expense during the 70s. And leaders of the Teamsters Union argued that all of Chávez's harping in the public sphere was simply about a jurisdictional battle over representation between rival unions. In other words, Chávez's was a story of sour grapes. In the face of such charges, penance and modesty and devotion proved all the more important to union rhetoric. It was the sincerity and devotion of Chávez, the person, the man, willing to give up his body, that was meant to stand in and prove the sincerity and devotion of the union at large. In engaging farm workers and consumers and policymakers, the union spoke a religious language of rights and responsibilities. According to the language of the boycott, American consumers, us, need to imagine our own solidarity with poor workers laboring far away in the grape and lettuce fields of the Golden State. Consumption is a matter of conscience, the union insists. The produce aisle in our local grocery store is a political space, and we deny ourselves certain pleasures, like grapes, in the hope of making a better world for them. Chávez combined an insistence on the powerful possibilities of dignity and of suffering and sacrifice with a modern Eucharistic reading of agriculture in California, a reading in which Chávez linked the food shared by consumers, purchased in the grocery store, consumed at our tables, to the bodies of workers whose sufferings in California and elsewhere echoed Christ's sufferings. This was apparent across the 1970s and the 1980s when the United Farm Workers made workers' health just as critical as wages and contracts in their social justice campaigns. Key to these efforts were the union's focus on the short-handled hoe, shown here. That instrument of labor control and bodily discipline used in many row crops throughout the 20th century. Work that Chávez tellingly called, quote, the most crucifying work of all, degrading, the most vicious exploitation of the human body. He and others in the union insisted repeatedly that consumers and outside supporters could remove that cross that farm workers bore, helping laborers live like people instead of like body machines. Quote, we have soul and God has given us dignity, he told a group in Calexico. Quote, but the growers still consider us only agricultural implements. Here in this park today, we make a solemn promise to enjoy a rightful part of the riches of this rich land and to throw off the yoke of being considered as agricultural implements. Another key to understanding the cultural politics of Chávez's world was the union's effort to draw attention to rampant pesticide poisoning in rural communities, and particularly to the cancer clusters in towns like McFarland, California. The union coded these as threats not just to the farm workers who live there, but ultimately to everyone in the United States, to all consumers of California produce. If the bodies of farm workers were exposed to parathion, to DDT, or to other, quote, economic poisons, as Chávez called them, then those chemicals just as surely will find their way into middle-class homes on the East Coast. This critical argument connected the fates of workers' bodies with those of faraway consumers. This emphasis, which ultimately drew from Chávez's Catholic thinking about the body of Christ, which links all people in some mystical fashion, here not just through the Eucharist, through the food, but through the sharing of California produce, what comes to our table, remained the critical subtext of hundreds of union mailings, of flyers and speeches during the late 20th century, and came to inspire a great deal of art as well. All of these campaigns, this religious rhetoric, proved enormously effective for the union, at least for a time. The language of conscience and of justice forced George Meany and other labor leaders to invest millions of dollars into farm worker unionization, despite their doubts about it and about Chávez. The Catholic bishops became strong supporters. East Coast rabbis shut down grape purchases in New York City and Boston and elsewhere. Hundreds of synagogues and temples across the nation refused to use non-union grapes for a sacramental wine. And the Massachusetts Board of Rabbis published a formal legal opinion based on Talmudic precedents that supported the boycott of grapes. deeply immersed. One leader of the American Jewish Committee called all this, quote, a model of sophisticated, effective cooperation between Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, joining hands in the common work of social justice. Chávez joked that he, more than anyone else, was responsible for getting many of these people to talk with one another for the first time across religious lines. Now, of course, the sight of Roman collars, of nuns, of rabbis and ministers on Union picket lines drove growers to distraction. One anti-UFW group declared, quote, ministers of the gospel are the greatest dupes for the socialistic and communistic manipulators in California. Union opponents hired skilled and expensive public relations experts in New York City to craft a portrait of a more devious and more militant and entirely unspiritual César Chávez. These portraits called Chávez a false prophet and questioned his unionist credentials. Quote, his appeal is primarily racial, one grower told the New York Times. They accused him of violating their constitutional rights, and they charged Chávez with harassing innocent, unsuspecting housewives coast to coast who simply wanted to feed their families. Conservative spokespeople for some of the growers, some of these spokespeople, Mexican Americans, went on national speaking tours to denounce what they called, quote, the Chávezzi Communazi forces and the union's, quote, blackbird of death. Now those arguments, those counter-arguments about religiosity never really dislodged Chávez from his moral perch during his life. Reviewing the African-American freedom struggle of the post-World War II period, historian David Chappelle has argued that, quote, white supremacists in the South failed to get their churches to give their cause active support. That was their Achilles heel. And I think in much the same way, growers and Teamsters found it all but impossible to sway many religious leaders into anti-Chávez positions. Few prominent national religious organizations refused to support Chávez during his lifetime. The decision of the Southern California Arizona United Methodist Church was typical. Members of that annual conference declared their support for the union based on Chávez's earnest, Christian, stalwart character. Chávez's connections with religiosity did prompt real controversy on the left. Traditional unionists often hated these signs of religiosity and all the God talk in the movement. Some young activists believed religiosity had no place in the organization at all. And sometimes Chávez got himself in trouble for speaking about things he didn't understand. Following the start of the Yom Kippur War, many criticized Chávez's controversial statement on Israel that urged, quote, all our brothers and sisters in the farm worker movement and all people of goodwill throughout the world to stand with Israel in its struggle to live and to be free. Still, despite this controversy, from 1965 into the 1990s, the UFW was able to occupy high moral ground on issues related to labor relations, immigration, and more, making the organization what the AFL-CIO would later call, quote, the conscience of the labor movement. When Chávez was imprisoned for 2 weeks for calling a nationwide lettuce boycott, workers created altars and held 24-hour vigils outside the Monterey County Jail. Catholic school kids wrote Chávez letters of support at the prompting of the nuns. Ethel Kennedy attended Mass outside the jail. Coretta Scott King bestowed her blessing on Chávez. Quote, 2,000 years ago in Bethlehem, a man spoke to the lowly about poverty and human dignity. Jesus of Nazareth was crucified, but he is here with us in Salinas today because the lowly need him again. During another struggle near Bakersfield, an elderly Dorothy Day was among 60 religious leaders jailed for participating in UFW picket lines. She announced that, quote, when you see churchmen in jail, you feel it has become a real Christianity. And Rome's approval certainly helped. In Chávez's private papal audience in September of 1974, Pope Paul VI called him, quote, a loyal son of the Catholic Church and a distinguished leader and representative of the Mexican-American community. And the pontiff indicated, quote, we're all indeed grateful to Mr. Chávez for the lesson which he brings to our attention. So I hope by now that I've convinced you that Chavez's movement, this foundational piece of modern Latino politics, was religious to the core and may still be. And that you might be able to see why. It provided a language of dignity, of liberation, of solidarity, even as it provided a framework for institutional and individual support by outsiders. Chávez's insistence that God is on the side of the poor, that what seems impossible to achieve will actually be possible, that legal provisions alone don't capture the limit of what's right and just, and that we're intimately connected with those who are unrecognized in our society. These are powerful starting points, I think you'll agree, for social movements. And they remain so today. If you listen closely, you can hear echoes of these arguments, I think, in the many boycott campaigns ongoing in the 21st century since the early 2000s. You can certainly identify these strains in the immigration rights movement, which produced in 2006 the largest public demonstrations in US history, and which prompted 20 New Haveners just this week, including Yale students, to submit to arrest in Washington, D.C. And you can hear it in the Democratic Party's efforts to capture the Latino vote, most famously in Barack Obama's adoption of the United Farm Workers phrase, si se puede, as yes, we can. Onwards, this phrase suggests. The people will be heard. Nothing is impossible. The future is bright. Have courage. All of which brings us back, in what may seem a paradoxical way, to the death of Chávez in 1993. His gravesite, which is also the UFW's working center in Keene, California, not far from Bakersfield, was declared a national monument by President Obama last fall. It was a nod to the unrecognized importance of Latino history as United States history. It was an acknowledgement that the Union and its supporters had played an important role in electing Obama twice. But it was also an affirmation of Chávez's perceived importance today in the 21st century as something like a beacon, an inspiration, a model, or a guide. Standing not far from Chávez's grave almost exactly a year ago, President Obama declared that, quote, "The truth is, we would not be here if it weren't for Caesar." And that the message that Caesar conveys for the 21st century is, in many respects, a religious one. Quote, "Every time somebody's son or daughter comes and learns about the history of this movement, I want them to know that our journey is never hopeless, our work is never done. I want them to learn about a small man guided by enormous faith in a righteous cause, a loving God, the dignity of every human being. I want them to remember that true courage is revealed when the night is darkest and the resistance is strongest, and we somehow find it within ourselves to stand up for what we believe in." President Obama, in declaring this a national landmark, concluded that, quote, "Our world is a better place because César Chávez decided to change it. Let's honor his memory, but most importantly, let's live up to his example." And in the phrase and in the language that perhaps best suggests Chávez's importance for the 21st century, Obama concluded his remarks with, "Si se puede." Thank you.